Another reason that Heaven or Las Vegas continues to intrigue decades on is because it was the final record the group would produce while signed to 4AD, which was a British independent label founded back in 1980. And there's actually quite an interesting story about how the group got their original break. So I am quoting Robin Guthrie here, Jamie. Well, we made 2 tapes and I went to London with them, and I gave one to Ivo, so that's Ivo Russel-Watt, co-founder of 4AD, and the other one to John Peel, who was obviously a BBC radio DJ at the time. We had no phone, so I wrote down the number of the phone box down the road and called between 5 and 6 on the cassette tape. And I'd wait outside every night for a call. There was not a doubt in my mind they'd both ring. John Peel wrote us a nice letter saying that it was really good and everything. And Ivo phoned us and said, hey, want to come and make a record? We were sort of naive and into what we were doing so much that we almost sort of expected it. Of course we want to make a record. We're fucking good. You know, no trouble. Great story. Anyway, the Cocteau Twins signed in 82, the year their debut came out, and they released everything up to Heaven or Las Vegas with 4AD. Combined with the growing turmoil within the group itself that Jamie's talking about, their decision to leave was eventually tied to their breakdown in the relationship with Ivo Russel-Watt. Anyway, this relationship between band and small independent label kind of got me thinking about other trends that you can notice about music in this time period. So I generally try and steer clear of sweeping statements that I'll end up regretting, but I'm hoping you're going to indulge me on this occasion, Jamie. If you bumped into a UFO tomorrow and they asked you for the biggest artists in British alternative music in the 1980s, or what Coachella's 2005 lineup could have looked like, I reckon the Cocteau Twins, New Order and the Smiths, as we've already mentioned, they'd be 3 decent names to start with. So throughout the 80s, the Cocteau Twins were signed to 4AD, an independent label. New Order was signed to Manchester-based Factory Records, another independent label. And finally, the Smiths were signed to Rough Trade, also an independent label. So I mean, there's a lot of big names there, a lot of smaller labels. Jamie, what do you reckon this suggests about music in the 80s? Because I don't want to come across as gushing or sentimental, because obviously it is 2020 and I use a mobile phone like everybody else. But it obviously seems like quite a foreign notion that someone like Billie Eilish, for example, might be signed to a particular label because she waited outside of a payphone every night for a week.
Well, I think it's a great question, but I also think it's important to be specific about it, right? Because as you say, a lot of this desire to return to a time with the indie labels is just sentimental, mawkish chat about bands that people used to like back in the day. But I do think that there's something lost now that music is dominated by multinationals. The question is just like, what specifically is lost? In answer to that, I think there's a few things. The first one being, like with Cocteau Twins, you hear a lot that Heaven in Las Vegas was supposedly the musical manifestation of 4AD's vision. And nowadays, I don't think that in indie or alternative music, there are as many labels which just define a particular sound. Like maybe with electronic music, that's still more prevalent. But like if you take like who's a popular indie artist right now, like King Cruel, he's signed to XL, who also basically have about 30 other massive indie artists with no particular thing connecting them all together. Now they're an independent label, XL Recordings, but they're also owned by a parent company called Beggars Group. And Beggars Group also own, you've guessed it, 4AD, Rough Trade, Matador and Young Turks. So even though they are independent labels, and I know that they advocate quite fiercely for indie label rights, it doesn't feel like quite the same thing to me.
Yeah. Because that's the thing about XL. It's like if you look at their roster, they've got King Cruel, as you say, but then there's like Sampha, Giggs. I'm pretty sure Adele. I'm pretty sure Radiohead. Their last couple of albums come out on that. It's kind of like, where's the common thread here? Like, where is the identifiable sound? And as you say, I don't really think there is one. As you also mentioned, though, I think for electronic labels, it's a completely different story. I think it's much easier to pinpoint what the sound is, because usually it's the kind of thing where like a DJ or an artist has a specific vision or works in a specific sound and basically just sets a label up to give themselves or their friends a platform. And you know, if I blindfolded you and played you 3 tracks from, say, like Liberty Sound in Bristol, or like Loafer's Swamp 81, or Feel My Bicep or 17 Steps or that kind of thing, I think you could very easily tell me which song came from which label. So I think in electronic music, those delineations is definitely still part of the scene.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing about kind of this idea of indie labels that I wanted to bring up was that, you know, you told this story about Guthrie going down to London with a tape and then waiting outside of a phone box. And we've already talked about this sense of fate in this band. And I think maybe the rise of more monolithic labels, or even indie labels becoming more monolithic too, is that those kind of like casual twists of fate that lead to amazing, almost fluky musical projects like Cocteau Twins just doesn't happen as much these days. Like, I feel like nowadays the random element in all that is algorithmic, right? Like if a band randomly gets boosted by an algorithm on YouTube or Spotify or whatever, that isn't because an individual label head out there has seen a band like Cocteau Twins and thought, fuck it, I'm going to take a punt on these guys. There's something much more mechanical and inevitable about it. It's the algorithm's leading you somewhere. It doesn't usually feel like you have a choice in the matter. It just does what it wants to do, you know what I mean? Like, to give an example of that, so Spotify's autoplay and radio recommendation algorithm has this weird habit of boosting particular songs. So the band Pavement, you would have thought, right, their most popular song on Spotify would be something off Crooked Rain, like maybe Cut Your Hair. For some reason, their most popular song on Spotify, their most streamed song, is Harness Your Hopes, which is just a random obscure B-side from the 90s. And if people have asked Spotify why this kind of thing happens with other artists, why are random small artists getting boosted, why are big artists getting random songs boosted? And a guy called Glenn McDonald from Spotify, who, believe it or not, holds the title of Data Alchemist, which is a complete coincidence because I hadn't seen that until after we talked about that earlier. He says that this jump in plays began in January of 2017, which is the same time that Spotify switched the autoplay preset and every listener's preferences from off to on. So the autoplay feature queues up music that resembles what you've just been listening to, based on like a series of sonic signifiers which are too complex to really understand. So what that means is that Harness Your Hopes had been algorithmically determined to sound similar to a lot of other music, and then was frequently being autoplayed to the point that it took on a life of its own and then eventually eclipsed the band's other tracks. Now, as interesting and novel as that is not the same as Ivo taking a punt on Cocteau Twins because they sent him a tape. And I think that random element, maybe we're losing something.
I think it's funny you mentioned that example, actually, because I remember reading an article about it, because I'm not massively into Pavement or in any way that you are. But I remember, I think it was the lead singer said that he was in like a bakery or a coffee shop with his daughter, like he was very young and wanted like a croissant or something. And he went into the shop and he heard Harness Your Hopes playing and he was like, what the fuck? Like, why is this on? And apparently he was just like, how on earth am I in this random coffee shop and this B-side that I released, forgotten about, fucking arse end of nowhere on the internet, is now being played in here. But yeah, if you go on Pavement Spotify, it's the most listened song. I think to finish alternate cuts, and I'll chat about labels, I think it would definitely be prudent to mention that Robin Guthrie and Simon Ramond actually set up their own label in 1997 called Bella Union, although I think Robin basically moved to France a few years ago to kind of follow musical projects, so it's solely run by Ramond these days. I mean, first of all, there's some really cracking musicians on that label. Bella Union have pressed stuff by the likes of Beach House, Fleet Foxes, Spiritualized, Midlake, The Flaming Lips, like we could go on and on. You know, we've spoken a little bit today about, you know, these larger conglomerates kind of buying out smaller labels, but still posturing them and presenting them as independent beings to kind of make them look edgy and cool. That is not the case at all with Bella Union. They're firmly an independent label. So big up to Ramond and big up to all the artists killing it on there, because there's some seriously good releases.